Thank you, everybody, for coming. Happy to see you here. My name is Mark Hansen, and I'm the interim director at the Practical Ethics Center. And pleased to have you here for another in our PEC Presents seminar series. Before I introduce Jim, I'll just alert you to the next presentation on our list. The PEC Presents is the first and third Mondays of the month, and the next one is on November 1st. We have Thomas Gallagher from the College of Technology who's going to be talking about privacy and responsibility in relation to information technology. So we'll leave a flyer by the door if you want to pick that up on the way out. But today we're very happy to have with us Professor James Birchfield. Jim is the Associate Dean at the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the university. Trained as a sociologist and a forester, his major interest centers on how people may reside and interact with forest and grassland settings in a productive and harmonious manner. His academic training is from the University of Washington, the University of Michigan. He continues to study effectiveness of community-based groups in the development of plans and activities on forested lands. His recent work has examined the principle of social acceptability in forest management and implications of stewardship contracting on public lands. He is formerly the director of the Boley Center for People and Forests here at the university. He's also worked for the USDA Forest Service, and he has conducted assessments of social conditions in the Columbia River Basin, worked in the International Division of the Forest Service in Washington, and helped implement forest management operations on national forests in Michigan, Ohio, Oregon, and the state of Washington. So we are pleased to have him here, and today he's going to be talking about, as the title on the screen suggests, decision-making on the upper Missouri River breaks. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks very much for inviting me, and I appreciate you coming. This talk is really about discourse. What helps discourse? How can we, as citizens, engage in deliberations about deeply conflicting issues? And we're going to use the Missouri River as a case study to be able to think about how is it that we can come together when we have all these competing values directed on a specific piece of geography. Now, I don't have any slides with any more text on them. The rest of these slides are just photographs. So if you just want to look and enjoy some views of the Missouri River in the summer, I recommend that you do that. I also recommend that you actually take this trip. This is the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. It's a 149-mile stretch between Fort Benton, Montana, and the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. It's a very historic area. It's the path that Lewis and Clark came up. This was the way west for the gold mines in Montana and the silver mines in Idaho. Fort Benton in 1869 was probably the wildest town in the history of the West. Because of this history and because of the resources that you're going to see in these photographs, this has been a very interesting area for Montana. And in 1976, this stretch of the river, this 149-mile stretch, was designated as a wild and scenic river under the 1968 Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And then in the second to the last day of the Clinton administration, President Clinton designated the area surrounding the river corridor as the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument. Some of the things I think you're probably most familiar with are these White Cliffs areas. This is where the old Eye of the Needle used to be before it collapsed. Lots of visitors float on canoes to be able to enjoy this experience. And when you leave either Virgil or Coal Banks, it's a 3-day trip before there's a takeout down at Judith Landing. Now, the Bureau of Land Management has been designated as the federal agency in charge of this national monument, and they're currently in the process of developing a resource management plan, or an RMP, under FLTMA for this national monument. And the process is going a little bit slowly. As a matter of fact, currently it's being held up because of oil and gas leasing. Obviously, there's something going to be happening in 2 weeks that might, play into the results of that decision. But at the moment, the resource management plan is on hold, although they have gone through the first steps of the NEPA process and have developed a series of proposed alternatives. Now, the very declaration of the monument in Montana was quite controversial. The U.S. representative and as well as the governor both opposed the designation, and even after the designation they went to the Bush administration to try to reverse it. Secretary Norton in 2002 made a statement that said we're taking off the national monument designations in the last days of the Clinton administration off the table, and they're going to stay as they had been designated under the law. Still, there are some rumblings in Congress about proposals to remove the 80,000 acres of private land that still reside within the monument, but it's fairly doubtful if that's actually going to happen. Now, what I want to talk about is how decisions were made leading up to this resource management plan and the role of citizens in this decision-making process. In 1994, after the Clinton administration had started a program called Rangeland Reform, a series of resource advisory councils, or RACs, were formed across the West, and Montana was no exception. There's a few states, by the way, that have rejected them, Wyoming being a notable example. But these were citizen bodies that were there to advise the Bureau of Land Management, and they were sanctioned under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and they have prescribed membership. And I'll talk a little bit more about their membership later. Now, the BLM used this Resource Advisory Council and its committees, what are sometimes called subgroups, to be able to provide them advice on how to be able to deal with this national monument. Now, in my talking about deliberations, I'm going to make some assumptions about public participation, just to be clear. My first assumption is that public engagement is an essential part of a modern democratic state. That this is something that we've acknowledged as a powerful ethic in our society. That people aren't just consumers of public decisions, they are actually actors within public decisions. And the second is that public lands decisions are political decisions. As citizens, we are in fact the owners of these public lands, and as part of a pluralistic society, the different interests and values in those lands make decisions about public lands political decisions. And then my third assumption is that deliberation is a necessary part of public engagement. You cannot have public participation without some form of discourse. And now I'm going to argue that the Upper Missouri River Breaks presents a positive example of deliberation, that this Resource Advisory Council and its committees in the BLM behaved as well as you could expect a federal agency to behave under these kinds of political constraints and under the law. And then the basis for this is that I think that under this situation, they followed 4 principles, which I'll try to illuminate in a few minutes. The first is that their conversations about what to do in the Upper Missouri River Breaks were grounded in an actual definable place. That is, some place that had identifiable people affected, that had identifiable resources, that had a history and a culture that people could grasp. The second is that the conversations were very carefully structured. There was a formality to the conversations. The Resource Advisory Councils operated under rules. The third point is that these conversations were supported. Not only were they grounded in a real place, not only did they have structure, but there was service provided these conversations that were independent of the BLM, and I must admit to being a player in this. I actually helped facilitate one of the subgroups operations that dealt with recreation management. I was not the only one. There were other facilitators who were involved in the Resource Advisory Council's deliberations. These support services helped this conversation and helped in the decision making. And then finally, the fourth point is that there was information that was provided. And this information wasn't restricted to scientific information, but it also included what I call cultural rationality. That is the set of local experiences and knowledge of the residents so that they could be defined and recognized as being legitimate. So, here we have this situation where I'm arguing we had the government behaving well on a difficult problem. And let me go through some slides here and show kind of some of the contours of this problem. First of all, it's the whole idea of wild. What does this mean? There's actually a definition in the regulations surrounding the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and a large portion of this 140-mile section is actually designated as wild, and this wild designation means, quote, rivers or sections of rivers that are free of impoundments and generally inaccessible except by trail, with watersheds or shorelines essentially primitive and water unpolluted. These represent vestiges of primitive America. Now, just for the heck of it, how many of you actually been down the Missouri River? Can I see a show of hands here? So we've got, about a third of the audience has really experienced this. So when you're out here in the river, this seems pretty doggone primitive. Especially, if it's a storm coming up over the side of the canyon and you realize you've got about 10 minutes to keep from having your canoe blown over. So we have this wild designation and this sense of it being important. Now, as you're going down the river, though, you observe this, and you observe this quite frequently, and this is obviously not wildlife. The livestock producers along the river, even in the designation of the National Monument, are able to keep their leases on BLM lands. And so we've got this terrific collision of these very significant kind of, ethical representations of who we are as a people. I mean, when you look at something like this, it conjures up for the residents there this sense of Western identity and tradition and self-sufficiency and families and competency. These are very powerful feelings for the people who reside there. And then when we see those wild areas, when we look at places like this, we're thinking of natural purity and we're thinking of ecological process. And you see a young child here fishing. And we're thinking of family bonding in a recreational setting and physical challenge. And perhaps most significantly, we think of this area as being scarce. There isn't much of the Missouri River all the way from here down by the Wheat, Montana place at Three Rivers, all the way to St. Louis, that is as wild as this. So the issue of scarcity is very much in play. And also involved are all these other volatile kinds of problems. Access to public resources. How are you going to get there? The use of commercial outfitters. The protection of private property. How recreation management is meted out and paid for. So let me just run through a few of these slides, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the features of deliberation. I mean, even when you camp, suddenly you don't necessarily wake up to an elk next to you, although that's possible. There's other kinds of living creatures that can interrupt you. There's private property all along the river corridor, and there's access to this private property. The individuals have lived here for a long time. They have a road that goes into this little farm here. And sometimes they're thinking about, maybe I want to set up my own little commercial business here. The shibboleth for the undesirable development among the conversations of people in the Resource Advisory Council was the hot dog stand. We don't want a hot dog stand along the river. And quite frankly, there's nothing to restrict that in terms of the ownership of that property. We even have ambivalence about what is private property. These are dynamic systems. This is Monroe Island, which is fast not becoming an island, as you can see. Here's the channel that kind of designates that island, and now it's really a peninsula on another person's piece of land. Instead of being administered by the BLM, now it's connected to another piece of property. Where is private property? What are the interests that are being meted out in private property along the river? Then there's this whole issue of infrastructure. How is it that we deal with visitors? This is at Hole in the Wall Campground, and there's some shelters that have been constructed here, as well as some pit toilets. Now, when the wind is blowing 50 miles an hour and the lightning is hitting about 200 meters from where you are, that shelter is really welcome. But if you're someone who thinks, wait a minute, this isn't what Lewis and Clark saw. There wasn't a fire grate when they came in. There wasn't toilet paper when they came up in 1805. What's this about? Again, we're kind of facing this ethical dilemma of how much infrastructure do we support? When you look at this doesn't, I'm not much of a landscape architect, but does that design fit that landscape? I'm not so sure. Look at the foreground here, this road that leads into Hole in the Wall. This goes over across private property, even cuts through some BLM land that a leaseholder has. There's a huge debate within the county government of whether or not this is a county road. Now, you also have practicality playing into this. If it rains, this road becomes impassable. I don't know how many of you have tried to drive out there in that mud, but you really, my Subaru with its nice four-wheel drive would not make it. And there's individuals who try to tow boats from Billings, along these roads. What happens when someone gets stuck out here? So we've kind of talked about some of these issues. Here's a composting toilet. Is that better than a pit toilet? I mean, these seem like, boy, what mundane issues. How can we have to deal with these? But these are the types of decisions, the devil's in the details in being able to understand resource management. By the way, people hated this composting toilet. What do we do about natural processes? Here are beavers that are gnawing away at the few remaining cottonwoods that are there. Why? Well, why should cottonwoods be a problem? Aren't they natural? Don't they regenerate? Well, we just happen to have the Tiber Dam and the Canyon Ferry Dam blocking the flood patterns of the upper Missouri River. So there's virtually no cottonwood recruitment along the river, and as you go down there, you see almost all the old trees are senescing. How are we going to replace these cottonwood galleries? They're the linchpin for the wildlife habitat. They're very significant for anyone who camps. When it's 105, the first place you pull off on the river is under the shade of a cottonwood tree. Maybe this is what we do. This is wild and natural, isn't it? There's all these different kinds of dilemmas that are facing managers as to how it is that they sustain this resource. Maybe we'll plant some cottonwood trees. That'll be a good idea. Well, how much human intervention is recognizing that primitive vestige of America? And what happens when the livestock come in and go, that looks pretty tasty? Do we fence each one of those? There's a high cost involved. Now, the experience that many people desire when they're on the river is exactly this. This sense of openness, this splendor of this massive area of real big sky and open water. Is this diminished if someone like that is right in front of you? What happens if there's 10 more of these canoes there? Is suddenly your experience a little bit different? So there needed to be information about how many people are here, what is happening. So what I'm going to talk about from now on is how is it that we're able, through deliberation, to address some of these issues? How is it that we can get to these very detailed and difficult questions of how we should interact with this marvelous system? Now, before I get to these 4 points, the 4 points that I want to make about effective deliberation, that is being grounded, that having structure, that having support, and having information, let me acknowledge the wonderful work that's been going on in terms of understanding public participation, even by some of the people in this room. There's been a lot published recently that really looks at the legitimacy of public participation, based largely in part of deep frustration with the public meeting process, with the interest group arguing, with what people call all kinds of pejorative terms, analysis paralysis, etc. But there's been enough views of public participation to recognize a certain set of principles. William Leach at Sacramento State has talked about the 6 qualities of the democratic process. And in addition to deliberation, he names 5 others. Inclusiveness, which openly welcomes people into the process instead of restricting access. Representativeness, where all interests of those have advocates. Procedural fairness, where all parties are treated equally. Lawfulness, where the law is upheld. And empowerment, which means that people actually have influence on a decision. This is not window dressing. Participation has to have some meaningful impact on the decision outcome. And I want to recognize Mark Hansen here, as well as his colleagues, Marion Hardequin and Peter Landris, who have just let me review a manuscript about 4 ethical principles of participation. A genuine deliberation being one of them, as well as equal opportunity to participate, equal access to information, and shared commitment. So we're seeing in all this academic work around this idea of decision-making and ethical decision-making, this focus on deliberation. So, okay, if we got to deliberate, how do we do it? What are some of the things that make it happen? And as I said, I've got these 4 ideas that I think are fundamental. First is this issue of grounding decision. This is a real spot. You can talk about this because you can name the river mile. You know what these mountains have names. People have been here before. There's old homesteads. There's a history here that has a contextualizing effect. And sometimes, defining this place can get quite muddled. And, I've been disappointed, for example, by the Forest Service's recent proposal to do an environmental impact statement for all the 3 major western national forests in Montana. Instead of having a plan for the Lolo and a plan for the Bitterroot and a plan for the Flathead, there's going to be one massive EIS. I'm troubled by that because I don't think there's any there. It's really hard for someone in Kalispell to be all that worried about someone in Sula. So defining the place is very significant. And it's going to be hard for me to talk much about this. I'm going to move on so we have some time for questions and answers, because Wendell Berry was just here on campus last week, and he is the apostle of place, and I hope many of you had a chance to hear him. And so for me to talk about the significance of grounding is a little presumptuous. But just let me quote Berry by saying, "To work you must first work in a place. I think the people who worked on this project understood that. The environmental community, the ranching community, the BLM all had a very strong commitment to this physical landscape. Let me talk more about the second principle, structuring the conversation. How do you get procedures in place that allow people to have discourse that is open and representative like those other authors were talking about? What features really seem to make that happen? Well, I think that there's a whole series of issues surrounding structure. Not only are they the way that the groups are convened and the members who are there, but it's actually the physical setting where you meet. Meeting on the river was very effective for the Resource Advisory Council. There was literally a group canoe trip that took place where members of the recreational subgroup with which I was most familiar went from spot to spot and would get out of the canoes and sit there and talk about it. It was real. It wasn't something that was abstract anymore. The other kinds of principles in representativeness are very difficult principles, and I don't have all the answers for this. Clearly, we have to acknowledge that there are ways to bias representation, that there's someone who can select people to be on certain boards, that, who makes up the rules as to who participates, how many is too many. The adequacy of representation is always something that arises. Our national interests, for example, being represented. And there's a whole literature that's emerging about the difficulties of this. What I'm suggesting is an honest effort to be able to acquire the different points of views, to make sure that you observe who is benefiting or who may pay the costs of some decision, and to ensure that there is at least opportunity for them to join in the conversation. Now, let me talk about a structure that is used by the Resource Advisory Council that I find quite interesting. And that is, they used a series of 3 caucuses. Perhaps you're familiar with this. And they identified in those caucuses a group, an odd number, 5 people who represented a specific large frame of interest. Commercial use was one frame for the Resource Advisory Council. So that included outfitters, included ranchers and other permittees, including mining interests, and included business people. And they had 5 people who were always represented within that caucus. There was the conservation's interests. That even included historians, but it had the usual suspects of American Rivers, the Montana Wilderness Association, Trout Unlimited, people who were very concerned about what is going on with the protection of resources. And then there was the public at large, public officials, which had tribal representatives, county commissioners, and citizens who had lived there for a long time. A dairy farmer who had not been terribly far from there was a member there. Now, interestingly, to get agreement among this structure, you had to have within caucus agreement of a majority and across caucus agreement. So, and the across caucus agreement had to be unanimous. All 3 caucuses had to agree on a proposal for it to go forward. And at least 3 of the 5 members within the caucus also had to agree with the proposal. So in a body of 15 people on the Resource Advisory Council, you could conceivably have agreement with 9 people agreeing, 3 in each caucus, presenting a majority within a caucus, and then across caucuses all agreeing. Now, interestingly, a lot of times the Resource Advisory Councils are presented as consensus groups. We only agree by consensus. But in reality, they'd set up a supermajority system, which I found very interesting and kind of a hybrid that you often see of other kinds of groups that might have consensus -1 or supermajority rules across all the participants. But by actually acknowledging that there were different interests and segregating them, I think it gave this decision-making group a lot of power. They were able to negotiate within their own caucus about what were the limitations of acceptability to them. Now, I don't want to say that this is the only structure. I just want to bring up that structuring a group to be able to deliberate is very important. People understood where they stood, how votes were made, how decisions could be advanced. It took a long time for the learning process for this structure to actually work, perhaps 2 months. But once it started, there was real recognition that those people had a responsibility to go out to their other interest groups and acknowledge, here's what we are thinking as the powerboat people. This is what we want. One of the commercial users was a powerboat rental operator. And he wanted more powerboats on the river, which on the wild section are restricted. So people had that avenue for him to go, and he advocated very strongly for his interests. And as a matter of fact, was quite influential within the group. So the first two principles, grounded in some real place, having a structure for the deliberations. The third principle is making sure there's some service provided. You know, I do facilitation of groups and natural resources issues, and I've been at it for a long time, and it's incredibly difficult work. Being a good listener is something that we're not all trained to do. But I and other facilitators who were involved in this group provided an incredibly important service, not only because we could help these conversations move along, make sure that the interests were clear, but also because we provided documentation. The facilitators made notes from all the meetings, distributed those to the BLM, distributed those to the local newspapers, and had available all the record keeping about the BLM's decisions. So if someone needed to know what was going on, where the resource management plan was moving, they could come to an independent group and get that information. You know, volunteers in these deliberative processes and these resource councils don't have a lot of time. It's difficult for them to ferret out all the information that is available. Having some support services to be able to promote these conversations was enormously helpful. And now the fourth thing that I want to bring up is information itself. What kind of information is useful? And this leads back to the title of this talk, this collision of science and cultural rationality. When is it that science information is used, and when is it that local experience is used? And how do you mediate those things? And that's the power of deliberation, is that it allows you to have the principles of science, that is replication, that is peer review, either through others who are there, that is verification, and that is reliability, more than one observer. You can use the principles of science for cultural rationality. In other words, you have multiple people talking about their local experiences, which might not necessarily have been observed or published in a scientific journal, but are really operating under the same principles of observation. In this particular case, science played a crucial role because the BLM had almost no current data on the vegetation patterns, the health of the cottonwoods, what was going on in river flows, and most particularly, what were the attitudes and expectations of the visitors themselves. And so they engaged in a series of contracts, one with a colleague, Neil Moisey here at the College of Forestry and Conservation, to conduct a series of visitor surveys about what people wanted. There was a presumption that everyone was operating under within the Resource Advisory Council and within the BLM that crowding was a serious problem. You could take your canoe down and you could go to that place by the White Cliffs that I showed earlier. Let's see if I can get that next picture. You could go here on a July Wednesday and there'd be 95 people there. And you'd go, oh my God, this place is being overrun with people. We've got to limit use. That's what we're going to do. We're going to have a permit system, and it's going to be just like the Smith River. And you can only have a lottery for people to be able to go down. But there was no systematic information to collect how much crowding is really going on. The next day, the next Thursday in that July, there might be 6 people there at Eagle Creek. And once we started surveying people about how crowded do you feel, what they told us is that most of the time, this is what we see. We don't feel crowded on the river. As a matter of fact, compared to many other places, this is the experience. And quite frankly, when we're here at Eagle Creek camping, we like to have a few other people around. And some of the other things that were a little bit disturbing were, we like these toilets. You know, don't take these away. Yeah, wild is fine, but I want wild with toilet paper. Now, being able to present this information and then talk about it and understand, well, what were some of the limitations, led to a whole series of different discussions. The level of discourse changed when science was applied. And it wasn't as science tells you to do this is that science tells you here's the answer to the questions that you have. Here's questions about crowding. Here's questions about people's expectations. Science played a very important role. And instead of saying, well, our cultural rationality is that it must be totally wild and there can be nothing like this, suddenly with this information that people really wanted these kinds of things, led to a series of compromises. And some of the compromises were very interesting in that we restructured the deliberations under a limits to acceptable change process, which perhaps many of you are familiar with, where you use a series of indicators and a series of standards as to what is desirable for the people who are experiencing the Upper Missouri River. And one of the key indicators was sight and sound. That is, this is what I like about the Upper Missouri River, is this experience of silence and not seeing anybody. What does that mean then for someone who's there? Well, it means that in fact we might eventually get to the point where there are too many launches along the river, where there's nothing except, seeing the rear end of somebody's canoe. And how can we figure that out? And we ran some models and looked at some other experiences, and we're actually able to come up with a number. If we have 500 launches a day at Coal Banks, it's going to be very difficult in this 44-mile stretch that's a really heavily used area for people to be out of sight and sound, to experience this. Well, the maximum number of launches in any day was 310. So we were well below that threshold. And the sound issue was an enormously important thing to people. I mean, you can hear a motor for about 2 miles along that river. And so the restrictions on motorboats actually became a little bit tighter in the recommendations coming out of the Resource Advisory Council. So by setting up independent objective indicators and standards by which you could hold, the group was able to structure its recommendations to be meaningful. Now, when we started this process, absent of those deliberations, it seemed like we're never going to get around this allocation issue. We're not going to be able to deal with motorboats. We're not going to be able to deal with the campgrounds. But there was a lack of information and there was a lack of dialogue. Within 1 year, the subgroup to the Resource Advisory Council and the Resource Advisory Council itself made 17 recommendations to the BLM, almost all of which have been incorporated into the Resource Management Plan. So through this process of engagement, which took an enormous amount of work, it took a lot of information, which cost money to do the surveys. It took a lot of support services, my time and the time of other facilitators who were paid, and we have some professionals here in this room who do this and recognize their value. The time it took to actually come up with the structure and to be able to mediate it out. And the time it really took for the kind of the political noise to go away from around this to actually get started. Now, I wish I could say, and I'm going to finish here in just a few moments and allow some questions, that this is, the happy ending and, oh boy, we can all charge ahead and, isn't life grand? Deliberations don't solve all the problems. There are still deep, lingering problems on the Upper Missouri River, most notably oil and gas development. As a matter of fact, getting back to this issue of grounding and identifying the place, the oil and gas industry has made such a demand on the BLM for dealing with the oil and gas leases and the boundaries of the proclamation is that the BLM is not even showing the boundaries on their current maps because they don't want to raise the hackles of political sponsors. There's difficulty in addressing road access issues, which in Montana are some of the toughest problems and could really change recreation use patterns. Now, meanwhile, something enormously positive has happened as a result of these deliberations. Even though these problems are still there, some of the most ardent defenders of the rights of private property along the river, some of the people who were most opposed to the National Monument in the beginning, major landowners along the river, have come to the BLM and are now seeking conservation easements, and have come to the BLM and are now looking at the river in an entirely new way, saying, the door has been opened for us to do things here that we didn't really think were possible, that we realize we can have a partnership with the BLM and the recreation use can actually be to our advantage. The recognition that they have other opportunities to have off hot season watering of their cattle and investments being made in areas off the river to move the cattle off the river. So ranchers and landowners who had at the beginning of the process seemed like they were not going to want to move away from very established positions, have now moved back and thought more broadly about their interests and are engaging with the BLMs in activities that 3 years ago pretty much everyone thought were impossible. So there's this creation and deliberation of something that is a little bit different. Not only do you have your instrumental kinds of decisions that can be made through discourse, but you also generate two other phenomenons that I think are quite important. One is learning. People really got an idea of what it was to be a landowner along the river and what it was to be a recreationist on the river through this kind of dialogue and through the information generated. And the other thing that happened was a development of a modicum of trust, that the Bureau of Land Management is not the enemy of the landowners here, that the people who support American rivers and who want to have floods come flush through there from the Marias Dam or the Tiber Dam are not the enemies of the landowners, that they really have viable concerns and interests which are as ethical as the interests of tradition and culture and competency. So I see this movement, because of this discourse of the people who are involved in the Upper Missouri River breaks, into kind of a new arena of decision making, where it's not all hard and fast and zero sum, but there's a lot of space to be able to make those decisions. And I view that as very positive. But I also view the continuation of this project and other natural resource ethical dilemmas as a really difficult challenge. Those deliberations take work. The amount of information, the support required, the structures to be upheld are things that are not free and require the efforts of professionals as well as the volunteer time of the people who are there. If we are serious about making ethical decisions on natural resources, we have to be serious about the amount of commitment and the effort that's necessary. And I hope that we are all up to that task. So thanks for your attention, and I'd like to entertain some questions.
First, I just want to acknowledge that this is being taped by Missoula Community Access Television, and thank them for that. And ask you, when you're asking your questions, to please speak up so that it can be heard. Thanks, Jim, for your presentation, and I guess I'll start since I have the floor. And just ask if you might say, you used the word cultural rationality. I just wondered if you could sort of clarify what you mean by that concept a little bit.
Sure, no, that's a good question. Cultural rationality is the ability of people through their observations and their daily lives to be able to come to conclusions not just about cause and effect, but about their purposes for being where they are, their purposes for doing work, and their expectations for the outcomes of decisions. A lot of times we think that the only way to understand something is to somehow take it apart and understand its component parts and how they fit together. But there's another way of knowing, and there are many other ways of knowing that I'm calling cultural rationality, that just happens by the presence of being there and of observing the phenomenon on a day-to-day basis. And they involve things like, neighborly exchanges. There was an interesting example from the Klamath River case in the recent Public Lands Law Review Conference, where one of the landowners said, exchanging plum jam was as important as any kind of meeting that we ever went to. I mean, plum jam doesn't really fit into any equation that I think I could conjure. But that is some kind of relationship that was meaningful to people. And so this cultural rationality is a series of relationships and cause and effect interactions that are not easily discernible, by other much more deductive means.
Would you say that in sort of scoping out this different cultural rationality of sort of different people with different sort of life ways or backgrounds, that there's also develops a collective rationality from this deliberative process? And
yes.
Can you say something about what that is?
That comes out of the process itself. I think it's something that emerges from this conversation. This collective view and collective understanding comes from this kind of collision of different points of view. I think that's the beauty of discourse, really, is recognizing that I can change my mind. I am not fixed in my opinions. That there is something that occurs with me through this kind of humanizing interaction, which allows me to say, I can adjust to this kind of collective vision that's a little different than my collective vision from where I came from, either as a child or as a person only dealing with my own interest group. Which is why I'm fascinated by this whole emergence of collaborative processes, because I think you're most receptive to something new when you're really confronted with someone who's very different than you are. And that's what those collaborative processes try to do.
Jim, the RAC, as I understand it, was involved in some way with the lead up to the National Monument designation.
Yes.
What impact did that have on what you're doing now, post-monument status? How did that color things? How did that set expectations or cause friction? Or what? First, maybe describe for folks what the involvement was in the National Monument process and what the impact of that was.
Sure, that's a fine question. Prior to the designation of the National Monument, there were a couple of very highly visible visits to the Upper Missouri River by then Secretary of Interior Bruce Babbitt. Once he came with the late Stephen Ambrose, who wrote the book on 96, Undaunted Courage. Max Baucus was on this river trip, and everyone was going, oh, isn't this a national treasure? At the time, the Resource Advisory Council had already formed and was dealing with other BLM issues on grazing permits and the other kinds of issues that they constantly have to deal with. But this Babbitt opened the door and said, we are thinking about making this a national monument, and we want your recommendations. And so from, I think it was 97 through 99, there were a series of meetings by this Resource Advisory Council, and they made a group of recommendations about the monument, ultimately saying that they did not want a designation to take place, that they could have this without necessarily being a national monument. And there were wilderness study areas and all kinds of things, and they made a series of suggestions on what could be done about livestock grazing, about access routes, some of the major issues that were dealt with in the resource management plan. Secretary Babbitt received this. He had another very highly visible visit, and there was this uncertainty about whether or not this was going to be designated or not. And then, of course, in the last days of the Clinton administration, it was designated as a monument. And some people who were participating felt like they had been hoodwinked by this. That, well, we thought, that you were going to do what we had commanded from our local control point of view, and you didn't do that. You designated the monument anyway. But interestingly, the Monument Declaration allows for cattle grazing and all the things that were the substance of the recommendations of the RAC. And as a matter of fact, that was our starting point with the recommendations leading up to the Resource Management Plan, and some of those ideas are still in there. So they really did advance where it went. Now, I think that there are several layers of political discourse going on. One is not at all about the management of the Missouri River, but whether or not Washington, D.C. has the power under the Antiquities Act to tell us what we can do at all in Montana. I think that was a lot of what was going on. There was a lot of fear based on they didn't have any information on visitor use. There were these wild figures coming out of heaven knows where, certainly not well-researched data, saying there's going to be 2 million visitors a year at the bicentennial. My God, people are going to be crawling into Big Sandy, and we better start building some new motels. So there's a lot of anticipation about what this monument designation meant, and quite frankly, some fear-mongering going on around it. And when a more rational set of procedures, well, actually, the Resource Advisory Council's actions prior to the designation were really quite civil, and the recommendations they came up with were quite approachable, and most of them have been adopted. I think what we see in a lot of these kinds of conversations are people who decide not to participate for whatever reasons and want to roll their grenades in if they can. The staying power of this group has been actually fairly impressive. And what you see now are these bonds between groups that you hadn't thought would ever ally with one another actually starting to make some progress. So, I'm hopeful that some of these things are gone, but quite frankly, they're not totally gone. There are still these kind of recommendations out there on the horizon that we can't have private property within the monument because it restricts our private property. And there's a sentence in the proclamation that is very clear that it's not going to restrict private property opportunity. And I guess, quite frankly, I would submit that if someone who owns land in the monument wants to put it up for sale, that the very first line in the real estate ad would say, "Inside the National Monument."
the concept, I guess, of negotiated ethics is, I mean, I know it happens in medicine, it happens in environmental issues, but were there absolutes that one of the three caucuses just said, this is the bottom line, and we won't negotiate this ethical way?
Yes. Absolutely. Several, as a matter of fact. You know, this is the most obvious one. We are going to have our livestock. I mean, you are not taking away our livestock. This is who we are. You know, you will destroy our lives if these cows go away. And so there was a lot of conversation about this because our survey data indicated this is something that a lot of visitors didn't like. They did not necessarily want to see cows in the stream. They didn't want to wake up the next morning and step in a cow pie. That was not, you know, the desirable kind of experience for them. But given that the group understood the significance of the values for these Western livelihoods and that the people resided there and that they owned this land, there was a recognition that boundary would not be crossed. I think there's a temporal dimension to this. I think that over time those things can be revisited. That's things that seem to be absolutely, you know, bottom line, non-negotiable can eventually be negotiated. Whether that's going to happen with the cattle on the Missouri River, I don't know. There were a couple other issues regarding you know, campground use, for example, that were also there. That, you know, this access point won't be opened up to a road because use patterns would change so dramatically. So on both sides, if there were sides, but on multiple layers of issues, there were things that people realized these are principles that for the time being we want to uphold.
Who thought up the voting scheme, and was it negotiated or dictated?
The voting scheme was dictated. The voting scheme was actually dictated in the creation of the RACs in '94 with those caucus structures. And that raises an interesting question. You know, whoever sets up the structure really controls the representation. And that's a very serious problem in understanding this issue of representation. You know, deliberative democracy is something that's a work in progress. And I guess what I'm arguing is I like to see, you know, steps taken that lead to certain kinds of resolutions in specific places. And I've seen some really positive resolution in terms of what's happening on the Missouri River. For example, some of the recommendations that are there are pretty interesting. One is that use will be concentrated in sites where we have these kinds of toilet facilities and shelters because they're desirable for people and they limit the impacts along the rest of the river. We have a lot of information about recreation use and the impacts of visitors. And it's those first users who have the most significant impact. The first couple of users are the ones who introduce weeds, who make the degradation, who actually make the site lower quality wildlife habitat. So what you really want to do is, if you're going to pump people into a 149-mile river corridor, you want them sleeping in relatively few places if you want to keep as much of this wild as you can. And that's a decision that was also made. Another decision that was made was, if you float down the Missouri River starting next year, you have to take a portable toilet. You can't go and scratch out this little hole in some rancher's land, because it's really hard to tell where the private land is here, and end up leaving your toilet paper there. And unfortunately, that happens a lot. And then that was something that the landowners realized, this is a benefit to us. We're seeing this as being something very positive. The outfitters were like, you know, do we really want this? But you know, this is something that was negotiated.
One final point. The question of how, when people come together in collaborative decision making, it seems like there would be a tendency in rather around polarized issues that people come in thinking they're going to advocate for their special self-interest, and don't sort of take a broader ethical view and ask the question, instead of asking how do I maximize my interest in this decision, asking a broader question of what should the community or the government obligations be about this particular place. How does one encourage or address that sort of special interest advocacy versus taking an ethical point of view amongst participants?
I think face-to-face deliberations are an enormously effective way to soften a position of an interest group when they participate. Suddenly the guy who is the power voter this is going to be the way it is sitting here talking with people who are from the American Rivers or from people from the Wilderness Association and realizing, you guys have a point. Or when we're here on the river and you hear that motor going down there, I see what's happening. I see why it is that sight and sound are important to you. So I think the very process of the deliberations is something that's enormously helpful in kind of taking away this more rigid, calcified point of view and turning into something that's this new collective point of view that Robin was mentioning.
But even sight and sound, I mean, the sound of the motorboat to the person who's advocate, that's a sweet sound. As is the Harley. It'd be hard to negotiate that away, saying, well, I see your point of quietness, because I love that sound.
Yeah. I understand that, but I think there's also an appreciation of when the motor is turned off. Even among snowmobilers and Harley riders and others that recognize that the experience is not only the sound of the machine, but it's where the machine gets you. And some common interests that were identified were the silence, were the openness, were the kinds of things that were perceived as wild. If there is no commonality, then obviously there's not going to be any agreement. And the search is in that conversation, is for those areas where there's a perceived overlap of those interests.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. This is an important issue for all of us, and thank you for helping us understand it.
Thank you, Mark.